Hey, it's me, Vicky Marie, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in this crazy world we're living in. So, we're going to talk about John George today in this video. Some news is coming out that, the good news, we've got some good news. John George is going back home. He will be home, and the funeral will be not this Friday, but the Friday after. I think it's the 24th, is it? The 24th of January 2025, John will be able to be laid to rest in a dignified manner. So this is John George, father of two, who seems like he was lured to Spain from Northern Ireland, maybe always with the intention of killing this man. He then disappeared after a distress phone call with his family, and there was a lot of consternation about where he was, especially when he did not return home on a flight that was booked on the 18th of January for him to return home from Alicante to Northern Ireland. Well, now it transpires as John then was never seen again. That resulted in a horrible search for John. His family came over to Spain from Northern Ireland, family and friends searching for him. It turned out, sadly, they were actually searching in the wrong place after having been given sort of wild goose chase, pinpoint locations. They even had professional search parties come out from Northern Ireland to help in the search, but it was all to no avail. It was never going to be to any avail because, unfortunately, they were actually searching in the wrong place. Anyway, finally, John was discovered, unfortunately deceased. John, it's believed, died by shot. Well, I don't know if it was a shotgun, but he was shot. And the Guardia Civil are working on this case. One person was arrested and has been released on bail. There are other suspects, and the investigation is progressing. But they have released John's body so that he can be taken home to Northern Ireland. Now, what's now coming out is it seems that John's return flight on the 18th of December was actually booked after John was already deceased. So somebody has booked that flight, it looks like, after he was already dead, using his card. Now, I don't know if you remember, but just before John's body was found, his bank card was found, sort of discarded in the street, not that far from the apartment where it's thought John met his unfortunate end. So is this what the people that killed him? They must have booked this flight after he was deceased in a cruel sort of attempt to make it look as if he was still alive, or to confuse the police, or to, lay a false trail, etc. I still think that whoever it is, they're not exactly a criminal mastermind. They haven't done a very good job of, maybe they think they're a criminal masterminds. Maybe they think they're in the big league because they've murdered someone. But, most sort of gangsters, if you like, make a bit of a better job of it than they have. It just feels very amateurish, the whole thing. Good, and luckily so, because that means that John has been found and he'll be taken home, and also means that the Guardia have probably, progressing with their investigation. So I thought we would just I found this podcast, and I thought we would just listen to it. This reporter is called Alison, and she's been reporting quite a lot on this case, an Irish reporter. And I thought we'd listen to this podcast that she did and see if we can glean any extra information from it. So let's have a listen.
is part of the investigation, because it is my understanding, this is an exclusive for the Belltel podcast, that flight was booked after he was dead.
His family soon voiced fears that the 37-year-old father of two from Twinburg had been murdered.
His family always believed he was murdered and say they were told he was shot.
The people involved in this, Sean, my message to them is, you will dance with the devil.
Then on Christmas Eve, those fears deepened. A video emerged on social media showing Mr. George in an apartment, appearing intoxicated.
The location of...
Yeah, that video, where I didn't realise it was Christmas Eve that video came out. But yeah, it was a horrible video, really, especially knowing now what we know about John, or the different videos and photos we've seen of John where he's always smiling. He was slurring his words. It did seem like he'd been drinking or taking substances, or perhaps a combination of both. He was looking from side to side. He didn't seem his usual self, smiling like he normally is. And it's very poignant at the end, isn't it, where he tips his cap and says, ring me ASAP. It's very poignant, the whole thing. And, the other people that you see sort of in the background in the apartment, it all feels very sinister. But I didn't realise that came out on Christmas Eve. I don't know who leaked it. But of course, we've seen it a few times, and it is very, very sad.
Where John George had been staying and where he was believed to be last, it was a very fancy apartment. We now know that where John George's body was a fair distance away from this.
As the days passed, John's father said he accepted that his son was likely dead.
Yeah, sorry, just interrupting Billy there. We'll listen to that in a moment. Yeah, that apartment where that video was taken, the phone call was made, is thought to be the apartment where John died. And the police, the Guardia Civil, are still, their theory, if you like, is that John was shot in that apartment. And that was under the cover of fiestas that were going on around and about, which are very loud and a lot of bangs and do sound like gunshots. As you know, regular viewers of my channel will know, if you've ever been watching Alive with me when there's been fiestas going on, it's like, it literally does sound like you're in a Call of Duty episode. So that's what the police think. And then where John was found was actually miles away from that apartment. So he was taken a fair distance. When I say miles away, not like 3 hours drive. It's probably half an hour's drive, maybe a little bit more. Depends which way they went there, that where his body was discovered was a fair distance away. And all that time, his poor family and friends was searching in that area and other areas that they'd been given by really cruel people, leading them astray and making them search. On Christmas Day, they were searching for the body of their deceased loved one. It's terrible.
We're here is John was murdered and his body dumped over here. Where is his body? We don't know.
A 32-year-old man from the Czech Republic arrested in connection with this death has been released on bail after appearing in court in Alicante.
So they keep saying Alicante. It wasn't Alicante where he appeared in court. It was Torrevieja. Anyway, never mind. It's in Alicante province. But, it's like saying, if Manchester is in Lancashire, it's like if you talk about little village in Manchester and saying it was in Lancashire. Anyway, they don't. It wasn't. He's not appeared in court in Alicante. He's appeared in court in Torrevieja, though. I suppose you could argue and say, well, yeah, it's Alicante province. So yeah, this man from the Czech Republic, 32-year-old man, he was arrested. He's been bailed on the condition. He's had his passport taken off him. He can't leave the country. He has to report every 2 weeks to the police station. But it is not thought that he is the actual person who murdered John, though obviously he seems to, he has some knowledge. So I think his charge when it comes, will be aiding and abetting, that kind of charge, not murder itself.
Belfast Telegraph's crime correspondent Alison Morris has been to Spain to investigate this disappearance, and she joins me now. Alison, you're very welcome to the Bell Tale. Okay, let's begin by saying that a man has been charged in connection to the murder of John George, a 32-year-old from the Czech Republic, has been charged with murder. He denies it. Now, this investigation and the judicial process is taking place in another country. Nevertheless, we do have to be cautious, as we would always be in this kind of thing. We're going to present the facts both as we know them and as we can report them at this stage. Can we begin by saying, who was John George, also known as John Hardy?
Yeah, so John George, he's from Belfast. He was a 37-year-old man. He was the father of two. He has two sisters and a brother. I suppose most of his adult life had been quite troubled. But, I didn't know the Georges until I went to Spain to meet them. And they're, a very sort of close and loving family. And they were very upfront about their son's past. What they had told me, and we know that this is true because it's been verified by other people, but John was a really talented boxer. He was really into his boxing, really hoped that could be his career in life. His mum told me that he would have been in bed at 9:30 every night so that he could get up to crack of dawn to do his road work before he did his training and go for a run and all the other things. And he took it really seriously. And she very proudly told me that as a kid that he had fought Carl Frampton and beat him. And that he's even mentioned in Carl Frampton's book. And Carl Frampton in the Sunday Life this week talked about how he knew him and how he had beat him when they were kids, and how he always thought that he was someone who had a real potential as a boxer. But then, and this is a story that I always say will resonate with many people, and I visit young offender centres, not on a regular basis, but at least once a year, and speak to the young men up there. And this is a story I've heard a million times. They get to 15, 16, and he started hanging around with a different crowd. He ended up getting in trouble. He went to a young offender centre. He was sentenced for a crime and was sent to a young offender centre. While he was there, his mum Sharon said that he told her that he had never spent a night not under the roof of his mother and father, and he cried himself to sleep, and he couldn't sleep when he got very upset. And then the doctor prescribed him tablets to help him sleep, which he very quickly became addicted to, and then started buying prescription tablets off other prisoners. And then obviously met people who were much more serious criminals than he was. And by the time he got out of prison, he had an addiction to those kind of medications, and he had a whole new host of new friends. And he then went through what we know is the cycle of offending in prison and offending in prison. And that was...
Yeah, so it's a familiar story for a lot of people. I think, sometimes I think young people, they go through these stages and you're just lucky if you don't actually get prison, because sometimes at that age, prison can only teach you. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, don't get me wrong. What is the answer? But feels like sometimes these young offenders in places, I mean, it depends on the crime you've committed, whether you should go to prison or not. But the thing is, once you go to prison, it feels like you learn even worse things, or you get involved in even worse things. Especially young people are so impressionable, aren't they? And, they're going to go into prison, meet people who've done much more serious things than them, and get involved. And unluckily for John, the drug addiction, that seemed to have started there with him, the problem with drugs. And it's like a rocky road, isn't it? And there he was, a young lad with all that potential, boxing, beating someone who went on to be a famous boxer, to get mentioned in his book, and all that potential. So very sad, isn't it? And I think sometimes some people have been sort of critical of John and his family, but I say there, but for the grace of God, if not go I or go my family, it could have been my son, could have been one of my nephews, could have been any of us, and or our loved ones. And anyone who thinks they've got a perfect family and people can't go off the rails, they do go off the rails. And if they're lucky, they don't stay off them for very long and they come back onto them. But unfortunately for John, that wasn't to happen.
Basically, the story, his family
His mother said that his criminality was driven by his addiction.
100%,
She said he came out of imprisonment as an addict, and so he went more into criminality because he was an addict. This imprisonment, whether it's prison
I've heard
or
this
young
1,000
offender,
times before, like,
and it just makes everything worse.
It's a story that I have seen in my 20 odd years thousands of times, of a young person who, at a very young age, starts hanging around with a new crowd, ends up in the criminal justice system, and just then spends the rest of their life trying to get out of it. And obviously, once you have a criminal record, it's almost impossible to get a job, and then you spend the rest of your life drifting in and out of that. So that basically seems to be the story of John George. He does not come from a bad family. He doesn't come from a dysfunctional home. His siblings are all lovely people. His brother Darren, who I spoke to loads of times, is a completely different character from him, but they all loved him dearly and tried their very best to get him help for his problems. But really what happened was he then was introduced to people through someone who had met in prison, and these are the people, I suppose, that were involved in much more serious offending than he had been up until that point. And after that, then he told his family at the start of December. There'd been a bereavement in the family earlier in the year. His sister said he's down a bit, his mood wasn't great, and then he said he was going to go on holiday to visit a friend, and they just thought, well, he's just going to go blow off a bit of steam, come back for Christmas. And that was when things clearly went wrong.
The love and esteem his family held for him were very, very clear. His father said something which I was very touched by, actually. He said he was a melter, but he was my melter.
Right, Billy's a great film.
And the impact on them and the love that they had for him is clear. And at no stage, have they tried to explain away. They
didn't try. They're not trying to say, oh, this is my wee angel son, went to Spain and these big bad boys took him away. That is not what the family are doing. They're very open and upfront. But we'll tell you what did happen. A lot of the young men who I meet who fall into criminality, a lot of them have came through the care system, or they come from very dysfunctional homes, or people with their parents might have addiction problems. None of that applied in John George's case. And the people who murdered him may well have thought that he was someone who, because of his past, that there wouldn't really be a great big uproar about, but they underestimated the resilience, and not only that, the love that his family had for him. Because
yeah, I think that's so right. That assuming that this family, they loved John despite his faults. They knew what he was. They knew that he'd gone wrong somewhere, but he was still their son, their brother, etc. He's still the father of two children. People are essentially, John wasn't a serial killer. He'd gone off the rails. He's done things that are wrong. And they, like she says, like Alison says, they're well aware of that. They're not trying to make out he's some sort of angel. He's not. And they said that right from the beginning. But, at the end of the day, he was their loved one. Sorry, I'm getting emotional now, but you love your son no matter what, especially, this is what's such a surprise, really, isn't it, for John getting involved in that? Because you can tell from this family the way that they've all pulled together and everything, and the way they've acted. And of course, his dad Billy just captured all our hearts by he wore his heart on his sleeve. He still is. He's struggling even now. You can see from the posts he puts on Facebook, he's struggling to come to terms with this. It's breaking his heart. So you can see that it does come from a good family. But just, what? You might think your family's great. You might think your child would never do that, or your brother would never. You just don't know. These sort of things can happen to anyone, I think.
And I don't say this lightly, I do not believe the Spanish police would have done half of what they had done had it not been for the George family landing in Spain when they did, and making so much noise and such a fuss. And they made sure they were heard. They made sure they were loud. They made sure that everyone knew that they were there, and they weren't going home until they got him. And at that point, you could see that all of a sudden, not just the Spanish authorities, but I was there in the very early days. But last week, you had other members of the media then traveling over to cover this story. And it's completely in credit to that family that they refused to be silenced. People might have thought, oh, this is someone who's been in and out of prison and no one will give a shit about him and we'll disappear and there'll be a bit of an appeal and that'll be it. But that's not what happened. And so I do think that anyone involved in this underestimated the kind of family that the George family are, and that they were not going to be silenced. They certainly weren't going to give up until they found what happened to John.
He was in Spain for a holiday, for a blowout of some description, from very, very early on in this story. And I do understand it's because he was actually someone who contacted his father constantly.
A melter, hit his melter. Yes, he actually said to me that John would have phoned him sometimes every 20 minutes, to the point where he'd have went, will you stop phoning me? What is it you want? He had phoned him at least, he said, 68 times a day, every day, and had done for all of his life. So he had rang him several times during this holiday, which was not a holiday. It just went wrong very, very quickly. He had then told other people that a friend of his was opening a business in Spain and he was going for the grand opening, as it was called. None of that happened, obviously. And he had rang his father a couple of times, and then he spoke to him at, I think it was about 1:30 on December the 14th, at which stage his son was upset and he clearly wasn't having a good time. And he had said to him, come home, get on a plane and come home. They then know that he was booked onto an EasyJet flight on December the 18th that was meant to come from Alicante to Belfast International. He never boarded that. And that flight actually is part of the investigation, because it is my understanding, this is an exclusive for the Bell Tell podcast, that flight was booked after he was dead.
Gosh.
So whoever booked that flight is clearly part of the Spanish police investigation, because someone booked a flight to give the appearance that John George was going to board a flight and come home. But the booking of that flight happened after, they now believe, the time when he was already dead.
So I'm speculating there, but it does sound like someone was to buy time.
It did buy time, because the family were just waiting on him coming home then on the 18th.
Although, because the phone calls to the father stopped, obviously, then they're very suspicious.
So the phone calls to the father stopped, but then there was obviously, when someone, and would say there.
So I just want to say, they say to buy time, but John was still lying in the same place that they'd taken him to after they killed him. I'm surprised, that no other attempt was made to hide him in a better place. This is what I'm saying about amateurs. If these guys were as fantastic professional criminals that they think they are, surely they would have made a better job of hiding John's body. I was starting to think that maybe he would never be found. But no, he was still there. So although it may have been to buy time, they didn't seem to do anything with that time. Like, as in, maybe they did do other things, clear ups at the apartments or whatever, or fleeing, because of course I know there's a lot of rumours going around, and, I'm not going to mention any suspects because I think that's going to come, I don't really like seeing suspects' names branded all over the internet, because, I don't want that to compromise this investigation or the subsequent trial that will come at some point. A clever defence lawyer will use all that in his client's favour, hung by social media, so... but yeah, buy time, but for what?
There's videos of him and he's clearly intoxicated in the videos. Then you think, did he break his phone? Did he lose his phone? Has he dropped his phone somewhere? Has he went into Benidorm on a blowout? So while it was unusual for him not to contact them, there's still 101 perfectly innocent explanations as to where he might have went from the 14th till the 18th of December, and indeed until about the 20th, at which stage his sister Courtney was the first that I had seen. She started putting things on Facebook saying, look, has anyone seen my brother? He was meant to come home from Spain on the 18th and hasn't arrived home. We're starting to get really worried about him. He has 2 children. He wouldn't do this. He would come home for Christmas or he would let someone know. And what she said to me one of the times I phoned her, at which stage this was still a missing person and they believed that he was just missing. She said, look, if he phoned home and said, I've lost my phone, or if I went on the tour, I need a flight. She says, like, my dad would have booked him a flight. He'd had the face of him and shouted at him and says, what are you at? But he'd have still sorted him out. So that's what we don't understand, why he hasn't contacted us. And so then it started after, I think, about the 20th of December, because the family were contacting so many people and trying to work out who he was with and what he had been doing, then they started to get really concerned. And that's when Billy George flew to Spain to start the search for his son.
Just to look at the timeline here, we mentioned on December the 14th, he contacted his loved ones for the last time. There was that flight, which he didn't get on, which, as you said, he doesn't appear to have booked at all. By December the 23rd, his family, as we've mentioned, were very concerned, and they launched a GoFundMe campaign to aid a search, and the family started going out there. Now, by Christmas Eve, a video emerged on social media showing Mr. George in an apartment, appearing intoxicated, dressed in a baseball cap and T-shirt. Now, Spanish authorities believe that a criminal now residing in Spain might have vital information about his whereabouts. But days later, then, at this stage, they officially declared John's disappearance a crime, and a luxury apartment believed to be the last place he was seen was sealed off as a crime scene. 2 men were questioned and not arrested.
That was at the point where I arrived in Spain. So that was the 28th of December. So all over Christmas, his family were frantic. His sister was posting on social media saying, this isn't the Christmas that we expected. We really need to find where John is. By the time I had arrived on the 20th, they had pretty much resigned themselves to the fact that this was no longer a missing person, that they believed that something untoward, something bad had happened to John, and that was where they were focused. So when I arrived that morning, I got a call to say that the location of where John George had been staying and where he was believed to be last had been located, and it was a very fancy apartment in Spain. If you travel towards it was supposed about 15 minutes outside Lasagna, which is somewhere a lot of people from Ireland, Northern Ireland, would go on holiday if you want to try and get the sort of location in your head right. But it was in quite a sort of plush neighborhood. There would be a lot of Norwegians, a lot of Dutch, a lot of retired couples, a lot of very affluent people. You could see by the prop.
You know, they keep saying this, but do you know what? I'm not being funny, but it's not an elite area by any means. Anyway, never mind. It doesn't matter.
That these were people who were of means, and so therefore this apartment had been rented out by people from Northern Ireland about 3 or 4 months earlier. And I went up and down that street and spoke to all the neighbours, and every one of them had a story to tell about the goings on in that apartment, and they stood out like sore thumbs, because this was you're speaking to people and they're from Holland and they're retired business people saying, we come here for the winter months and rent this out in the summer months, is where we live. And all of a sudden, these people who were having parties, there was motorbikes coming back and forward, there was countless cars coming back and forward at all hours of the day and night.
Yeah, I think they definitely would have stuck out like a sore thumb, because it is, but living there, I mean, not in the holiday months, maybe in July and August you'd get younger people who are out on holiday, but families probably, you know, it's not really a place there. I wouldn't say it was a place where young people would go on holiday like young single people. But yeah, they would have stuck out because there'd be a lot of retired people there, living there all the year round, or maybe living there in the winter months. Those lucky Europeans who are still in the European Union, who can come and go as they please. So yeah, they would have been unusual, I think, in that sense.
There was jet skis, there was a Harley Davidson parked outside. These were mainly very young men, and they said that immediately there was alarm bells going off, because it's not a party place. This isn't Ibiza or Benidorm. This is a very quiet residential part of Spain. So immediately they stood out like sore thumbs. And so the neighbours all had a story to tell about them. And they said that the Guardia Civil had been at that apartment several times, where people had obviously made complaints about noise and all sorts of other things that were going on in it. So when I arrived, the police were there outside it. You could see through the fence. It had a sort of security gate on it, but you could see through, and it had its own private pool. There was a jet ski parked in the driveway. And you could see someone had decorated a tree for Christmas. And this is key. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because this is something that one of the neighbours told me. I'll get to in a second. And there was 2 young men standing at the door being spoken to by police. And some of John George's family were standing outside in the street. You're in Spain, and people who live in Spain all have a lovely, healthy glow about them. They're living in much nicer climates than we're living in. You could see people walking their dogs up and down the street, and they all have a tan. They're all looking like people who are living a nice life in Spain. And the 2 of them were the colour of like 2-day-old porridge. Do you know what I mean? They had their hoods up.
It's funny, but I'm that colour as well. Thing is, you do become a bit nocturnal when you live here all the time. I'm not talking about those people there. They probably don't live here all the year round, maybe, and they come out and they get out in the sun and everything, because that's what they're here for. But I think I think when you do live here, you do not go out into the sun so much. But I would suggest that those guys, they were living probably a nightlife, sleeping all day and up all night. You know, young lads, they do become a little bit nocturnal. It's a very that's a very typical thing in Spain. Not only that, with the Spanish as well. You know, they're not really interested in the sun so much. You know, when I don't know what those men were up to, but they probably were living more of a nightlife.
Unshaven, the two of them looked completely unkempt and in an absolute state. And the police were speaking to both of them. Now, I must say that both of those young men were not suspects in the murder of Mr. George, but they were believed to know information that they hadn't passed on to the family. They had information that could have helped the family, they believe, and they didn't pass it on. And that was their involvement, or alleged involvement in it. So this was all going on at this point in time. And I had spoken to one of the neighbours, and she had said, look, there were people living in there and it was all lit up for Christmas. That Christmas tree in the garden was all lit up. And then on the 20th of December, that place went into darkness and never lit up again. The tree never went on. The lights never went on. The shutters have stayed down. And I thought it was strange. So she had said, so what we do know is that John George goes missing on the 14th, and less than a week later.
Yeah, so the neighbours would definitely notice that if it's a place where there's normally loads of stuff going on and then suddenly, boom, nothing, of course they would notice that. It's chilling, isn't it, to think of what perhaps happened there. And poor John, that's a haunting last phone call, isn't it, that he made on the video call.
That apartment falls into darkness and all the lights are never switched on again. By the 28th of December, the Garda Civil are treating it like a potential crime scene and have forensic officers and taking items away from inside that apartment. And what also, and this is where I believe has led to the discovery of his body when they did, they also took CCTV from a lot of houses in the street. Now, by Spanish law, your like Ring doorbell camera, your CCTV can only look at your property. It can't be anyone else's property, look out under the street. But what did happen was a lot of them had very fancy cars that had dash cams on it, and there was a big camper van across the road that had a dash cam on the front and the back. And I was speaking to the owner of that, who said he had a quick check through it before the police came and took it away, and he could see in and around the 14th and 15th a lot of activity around that apartment. There was a lot of cars going, a lot of activity. He says there was no gunshots, there was nothing like that, but he said there was something odd going on in and around there at that time.
Clearly there's information, we can't speculate, but
I'm just telling you what I know. There's things that are speculation I can't tell you, but I will tell you what I know. So obviously, because that apartment was close to Wasteground, that led to a search in Wasteground. And then a couple of days later, on New Year's Day, the K9 Search and Rescue arrived from Northern Ireland. Joanne Dorian is the patron of that charity. They've won countless awards. They found people in the Turkish earthquake. Joanne is obviously the sister of Lisa Dorian. So remember saying to the George family, if anyone can empathise with the situation you're in right now, it's Joanne Dorian. This is a lived experience for her. So they came and arrived, but they searched that whole Wasteground. There was nothing there. We now know that where John George's body was a fair distance away from this. I know one of the Spanish media outlets reporting it was 45 minutes away. It wasn't that far away. It was on the sort of, if you take the motorway to Torrevieja and then just turned off.
It's definitely not 45 minutes away. I'd say it's about 30 minutes, maybe even a little bit less, depending, she's saying if you took the motorway and turned off it, or you could go along the coast road and turn off the other way, or you could go the back roads. There's lots of different ways you could arrive there, but none of them would take longer than 30 minutes.
Off on a random path. It was in private land in there.
They found the body then on the 8th of January, but frankly, it would have been a needle in a haystack. So
to find it themselves would have been a needle in a haystack. K9 Search and Rescue are brilliant, but they would need at least a mile radius to search. They were looking in places where they had got leads, and this is another thing. The family were given constant.
Yeah, they had no chance of finding John's body. It's a shame, and they tried their very best. They did the best that they could. But now you just know that they had no chance of finding him at all. And as she's just about to say, that's due to the fact they were given false coordinates.
misinformation and disinformation. And there's a difference, because misinformation is just people who might be well-intentioned, but they're internet sleuths who get themselves obsessed by these real-life true-line crime stories. They go, have you checked this, or did you look there, or I've heard this, or I've seen this online. Disinformation was people who were deliberately sent them on wild goose chases, which also happened.
Well, both things are bad, Alison, to be honest. The internet sleuths, the Spanish police did reveal by the end of December that they believed that John had been shot dead before Christmas. So that's what they said. It was also reported that the two main suspects were blaming each other and had refused to hand over the location. Now, early in January, one suspect linked to the disappearance skipped bail in Spain and returned to Northern Ireland. We understand the same flight as John's partner. And also, we can report this, that a young woman who was in John's company prior to his disappearance posted a video online denying involvement and saying that she had any information she had passed on to the police. So we can say that. But we can also report, and I find this extraordinary, that one of the suspects has contacted the family.
Well, one of them was the Czech Republic guy who's currently on police bail. So he was arrested and questioned, but he was in contact with the family a fair bit. And he was also obviously blaming it on the other person. The family had originally spoken to this guy. When I say the family, I know that Billy George had originally spoken to him, told him he was coming to Spain. At the start, he was, oh, sure, I'll help you. I'll tell you where he was. Then he arrived in Spain, said to him, can you tell us where you are, and I'll come up and see you to see if I can try and work out where John is. And he went, oh, I'm not giving my address to a stranger. And then he got rid of that phone, and he has not spoken to the family since. But somebody close to him has. These type of investigations are a roller coaster. You get information and you think that might be something useful, and then that turns out to be a false lead. Then you get more information, that turns out to be a false lead. And they were really going through the ringer while I was there. But one of the days, Darren George, John's brother, loveliest fella you can meet, he said, we're getting a map. So someone who was linked to, let's just say, one of the suspects had said they were going to send a map with the location of where John's body was. At this stage, they were totally resigned to the fact that he had been murdered. And someone who was among the search team, and by this stage there was lots of their friends and relatives in Belfast, all with t-shirts on with his face, who were part of the search team, and a rumble went through them all. We're getting a location, we're going to find him. And I could hear someone saying, phone the Kevin Bell Trust to make sure we'll have him so we can get his body home. And all of this was happening. And then the picture of a map came through. The map is in the Belfast Telegraph. It's on the website. People can go and look at it if they want. And Darren said to me, because I would know that area of Spain fairly well, and he said, where is that, Alison? And he showed me it, and that's nowhere. It was a blue line drawn around probably maybe 65 miles square radius. Like, send you, I'll tell you where that body is. It's somewhere between Belfast and Dundalk, and anywhere either side of it. It was just nonsense.
Yeah, it was. It was ridiculous, and it was wrong as well. It's just awful. That's just, it's worse than anything, isn't it? But that this family, they're desperate to find their loved one. And instead of even just maybe saying nothing, you actually give them a false location. So they end up spending a month searching places where you're watching it all happening on social media. They're never going to find, they could search those areas for years and they will never find John, because John is not there. That is really, really, it's foul enough to murder somebody. But to do that, to lead grieving loved ones on this sort of wild goose chase, that's like just as bad again, if not worse, isn't it? Just horrible, horrible people. And, believe me, I honestly don't know how they sleep at night. Maybe they're not people who have any conscience. But it'll all catch up with them one day.
And that's what I mean about disinformation and very hurtful wild goose chases they were being sent on that were happening while I was there. And so a lot of that was, I think, deliberate, maybe to try and break them and get them to go home, or also then just to send them in the wrong direction. The guy who was on the plane, because I was on that plane on the way home with John George's partner, and she still had the t-shirt with his face on it. He was one of the two young men who were in that apartment the morning that I was at the apartment in Spain. So they weren't suspects in the murder. They clearly travelled over from Northern Ireland to live in Spain as part of this allure of a great life. and he had then been spoken to by police and was on Spanish bail and had legged it. The police at the airport, the PSNI officers I spoke to there, said, look, we can't do anything about this because the Spanish police would need to have issued a European arrest warrant. It's not called a European arrest warrant now. It's an agreement after Brexit. It's a treaty. But we don't have any reason to arrest him. We've just been told he's on the plane. John George's partner was very distressed at this stage. She had to be put on a separate bus to the terminal to keep her away from any further contact with these people. So there's a lot of characters involved in this, and I know it can get confused, but we have 2 main suspects, 2 men and one from the Czech Republic. And then we have a cast of characters who are either linked to alleged aiding and abetting of the killers, of giving alibis, of sending false leads and false information, and then of potentially helping finance the situation of the person who is on the run. So the main suspect has not been arrested yet and hasn't been spoken to by police. The guy from the Czech Republic had. The interesting thing I found out about him is he had left Spain shortly after John George is believed to have been murdered and went home to the Czech Republic, but then returned to Spain, which I thought was interesting because he could have stayed in the Czech Republic and it would have been much harder to find, but he did come back again. So he is currently on police bail in Spain.
The 32.
That's interesting. I didn't know that he'd left Spain and then come back again. Maybe he hasn't got anything to hide, or maybe just thought it's best to front it out. Thing is, if you're not a killer, even if you've done other bad things, but you've not actually killed somebody, you're not going to want to be the one that's held responsible for something you haven't done, are you? So maybe he was advised to go back to Spain, front it out, just tell his story. Maybe he is innocent in the sense that he didn't actually kill John, but of course he had information. I still don't think it's actually clear how John's body was found, whether it was a tip-off from that guy or from anybody else, or whether it was found by, following the car, the car they had, I think there was a rental car, so it probably had a tracker on it, or following phone data or whatever. We just don't know. It's not clear. So, yeah, this guy from the Czech Republic, he went home and came back. So anyway, he'll be in court soon again. The way it works in Spain, it's all has to go through a judge. So, he's been released on bail, really, which I think is, but I don't think has to be any money put up. Like in America, for example, they normally have to put up a surety, don't they? I don't know how that works in the UK. Is it the same? But I don't think you do in Spain. So he's on bail, but he's had his passport taken off him. Having said that, you don't need a passport to travel around Europe, but he's not going to go. He's known now, isn't he? So he's not going to do a runner.
2-year-old from the Czech Republic was held on suspicion of murder last Tuesday, just hours after the gruesome discovery. He was bailed by a judge after being told he's been investigated as an alleged accomplice. And he, I understand, his lawyer said he just isn't involved in this.
I do believe that the judge's words in that case are very important. If people read the court report, he said as an accomplice and aiding and abetting, and that's very significant. So there was a lot of information put out about the guy from the Czech Republic claiming he was Foreign Legion and ex-Special Forces and all sorts of things, which was clearly designed to make him look like a very dangerous character. But a lot of that was coming from the other side of this, the other suspects' supporters. So he appears, at least, to be cooperating with police in that he hasn't on the run, he hasn't took off. He did return to Spain and he has been spoken to by police, albeit in the presence of a solicitor. The family, I suppose, are getting frustrated as to where are these other suspects. You can't just disappear off the face of the earth in a modern world. If you have to travel, you need to use a passport. You need money to survive, to pay rent on wherever they're staying, for living expenses and all sorts of other things. And they're getting frustrated.
The Spanish police, none of us here are experts on the Spanish police and how they go about it.
It's a very different system.
Very different system. Now, I would say that any formal charges would only be laid shortly before trial. That's the custom in Spain. So I think for the George family that this makes the whole thing a lot more distressing, a lot more complicated.
It's wildly frustrating because you don't understand the system. And listen, I have friends who live in and around that part of that sort of Alicante region of Spain, and it's gorgeous and they have lovely lives. And sometimes I go, I'd love to retire to that. But any country is lovely until something goes wrong in it. And then you have to navigate a completely different system of law and of police, and there's a language barrier. I mean,
Exactly. You know, this is what I always say. I mean, I've lived in Spain nearly 30 years, and there's lots of things I love about living in Spain, but there are some things that honestly, and I speak Spanish, you know, that's what I do. I'm a Spanish teacher, but it's not only that, it's not only the language, it's understanding the system. You can't get your head around the system sometimes. It's very unpredictable, it's very arbitrary. So it'll be really frustrating for John's family because they want to know absolutes. They don't want to know, oh, well, this might happen and that might happen and blah, 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 blah. They want to know this is going to happen. But unfortunately, in Spain, that's not going to happen. You know, trying to sort of wend your way around the Spanish system. God, you know, it's not a question of whether you understand the language or not. It's just the way the system is. It's very unpredictable, very arbitrary. And they'll get there, but it'll be slow. And that must be so difficult for John's family. You know, my heart goes out to him because I know what it's like.
There's several things that are different in the Spanish system. You have to have an almost completed case before people can be charged, whereas here you'd be charged with an offence and then the police and the PPS would continue to investigate while it was going on. In Spain, that has to be completed and then you're charged and then you're brought to court, and that's how it works. Also, the extension that was applied for in relation to the guy from the Czech Republic, what happens here if they want to hold someone beyond the 72 hours is they go into a court held in camera or a closed court, which is also what happens in Spain. But intelligence is put before the judge by the investigating officers. They say, look, this is what we're investigating. We can't make all of this public yet because it could hamper the investigation, but this is why we need to hold this person.
Doesn't have to stand up and do this in public.
Yeah, so they do it in a closed court. What happens in Spain is the actual accused is put into the dock and questioned by a judge, and the judge then determines whether or not they should be held longer or not. There's a whole raft of things that are very different, and they have a lot coming down the line to them because if someone is actually ever charged with this, they then have to navigate the Spanish court system. But for now, they were finding that very frustrating. But what I will say is for the majority of that time, obviously the focus now changes on trying to get someone charged with this. For the majority of the time that I was with them, they just kept saying, we can't leave him here. We need to get his body and get him home. And Billy George has promised his grandsons he'd bring their father home. And I could tell, looking at his face, that he carried that burden very heavily and that he really wanted to make sure that he kept that promise.
I bring him. When I see the two boys later, I'll just give them a, you know, they're now part of our world now, you know. But the two boys, we'll never forget them. Yeah. We'll never forget them, of course.
And so the night that his body was found, the Garda Civil rang them and told them. And remember what I said, let's go back to the camper van and the cars coming and going and the CCTV. All of that will have led them to the location where John George's body was, because they would have been able to see the number plates of the cars that were coming and going from that house that night. And then, like any modern country, there will be speed cameras and number plate reading cameras that they will be able to trace the location of those cars to where they were and the general area. They'll be able to ping mobile phone signals off mass as to where they were, and they know who are the suspects is in this. So the Spanish police knew a lot more than what they were saying. We understand that they don't have to tell you everything, and they can't tell you everything. And they did find the location, which was very remote. So they clearly had intelligence to that effect. They have involved Interpol as well, which is for two reasons. It means that they've access to criminal databases in other countries where the suspects might be from, but then they can also tell if someone's passport's been used or if they're living in a different country, they've tried to take themselves off somewhere else.
So we say, once again, it does appear from what we can say at this stage that a family who really get involved and to put pressure on police services and to take the step of publicising a story can, I suppose, inspire action.
A campaigning family, there's nothing as powerful. A family that refuses to be silenced. They could have very easily said, John was in and out of trouble and he went there.
I don't agree with this at all. That the Guardia are not going to not research into a murder. I agree that the family have put pressure on, but sometimes with the Guardia will do their thing. They won't do it through influence from the family. So this I don't agree with. The Guardia would just do their investigation as they would do. I've heard. With remember the case that we looked into of Henry who went missing, the young lad, and he's still not been found. And his mum thought that the reason the Guardia wasn't sharing information with her or being forthcoming enough was because she was Colombian, but she's found since she started researching, joining missing persons groups and things, that is just the way the Guardia is, that they're the same. It's not because she was Colombian. They wouldn't have treated John George any different because he was not Spanish. That is the way the Guardia is. That is the way they work. They don't worry about, how they look to the public or whatever. They just do their thing. There's no what's the word, so like in the UK, you normally at least get the police coming out doing a conference trying to keep the public quiet, or trying to give as much information as possible. Your communications department, forget that. As far as the Guardia is concerned, they don't care about communicating. They're just doing their job and getting on with it one way or another, and that's what they were doing. And I don't, this is one, so I do agree with a lot of Alison saying I think this has been a very interesting podcast, but I don't think it would have made any difference, to be honest. I mean, it's always good to keep the pressure on. It's always good to keep the pressure on, but also with the Guardia, there's a way of dealing with them. And sometimes, I think there was one time, wasn't there, when Billy said he was told to leave the police station because they won't, how can I explain it? If you get angry with them, then it's not only the Guardia, this is how it works in everything in Spain. And you're trying to deal with bureaucracy in Spain. If you get angry and frustrated, doesn't mean you get seen quicker or you get dealt with better. It means completely the opposite. That's the way it works in Spain.
And if we speak, people say things about us, so they'll judge our family. They didn't care less. They were like, no, we're standing here as a family and we're here to find our son and we're not going home without him. And I was glad that his remains were found, because while they were there, there's quite a few people who have went to Spain and have never been found. And one of the days, and I could see looking at the hurt in their face, they'd went to a wee cafe just for a coffee, and the girl had seen the T-shirts with John George's face and said, there's so many people who have went missing here and never been found, and there's a family come every year and they have hold a vigil and say prayers and stuff because someone who'd been missing like 10, 15 years ago has never been found. And I could tell they were thinking, what happens if we don't ever find him? And the fact that he has now, well, under Solicitor Ken Winters, they met with the police this week because they're still frustrated about the lack of information. We know through when they've went to the morgue and stuff that he was shot, but officially that hasn't been confirmed by the Garda Civil. They still don't know when the body is going to come home so that they can have a funeral, and they don't know.
Well, they do know now. So, I think the Guardia always gets, I'm not trying to, stick up for the Guardia. They've got they're difficult to deal with. I know that. I've dealt with them for years. I've interpreted with the Guardia since 30 years ago when I first came. Well, not when I first came, when I first learned Spanish. They're hard to deal with sometimes. But that's the way they are, so it feels like I'm sticking up for the Guardia. I'm not. They're frustrating. They're difficult. The point I'm trying to get over is that's just the way they are. They will not change, and the way of dealing with the Guardia is not by getting angry with them, because that doesn't. Now they are family, they know the importance of family. Spanish people, their family is everything. So they will have tried their best, whoever John was or whatever he'd done, they would, for that family, they would try their best to get John back, but they do it in their own way. Anyway, it's happened now. So first of all, they found him. They found John. So, I think the Guardia needs some recognition for that. Also, yeah, they're working as best they can with the family and with the Northern Ireland Police. And now they are releasing his body. So they are doing the right thing.
Anything really about the investigation and what's going on. We just have to put our trust that the Spanish police know what they're doing, and that this person who is missing cannot stay hidden forever. Eventually they will have to surface, and that's something that is still waiting for them. There's a lot of hurt, I think, still to come, a lot of details which I think are going to be very distressing when they eventually do come out and are made public. But yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes families just accept their fate and they quietly sit at home and grieve, and for some people that's maybe the best thing to do, but for the George family, they just were not going to be silenced. And I think that it shows that the power of a family like that can really inspire or spur people on to carry out an investigation, which may not have happened in the way that it did had they not arrived in Spain when they did.
Sorry.
Also, Marsh,
I think it's great what the family did, and but it won't have made any difference to the Guardia. But again, because I have seen this a few times when Anna Knežević first went missing in Madrid. And I've spoken to her best friend a few times by message, and she was the same. They were all so frustrated. They weren't getting any information from the Guardia. They didn't know what had happened. And it was just, and then it seemed like nothing was happening whatsoever. It all went quiet. You couldn't get any information, nothing. And when I went to Madrid on location and found out from the courts, it was being treated, it was totally secret. They could not even tell me at the court that was the court where it was being dealt with. That's how secret it was. It was like, well, as this case, because I'd heard that the case had gone to the gender violence court, which is one of the most serious courts. And when I tried to find out about that, they couldn't even say yes or no. So not only giving out any information about the case, but they wouldn't even say, yes, it's gone to the gender violence court, or no, it hasn't. That's how secretive they are. So then felt like nothing was going on. And then boom, one day, the husband's arrested. And we found out all these things about what actually there had been, this big investigation that had been going on. And it was Colombian. She wasn't Spanish. Her family were in America, and her friend was in Sweden. So but the Guardia still dealt with it. They're not going to let a murderer go free just because they can. They just. I think it's very sort of down on the Guardia to suggest that they don't investigate things. Unless you push. They do, of course they do. But, the family going over there and that, I think, I hope they won't mind me saying this, but I think the Guardia might have been sort of glad of it in a way, because as all that noise was going on, a bit like with Jay Slater, remember it was exactly the same with Jay Slater, all the social media sort of furore, like over that, everyone willing the family to find John and all that going on. That will have been, in a way, good for the Guardia, because then they can get on with their investigation quietly. That's what they did with Jay Slater. They said they'd stop searching for him because there were so many people turning up and everything. So in the end, they said they'd stop searching for him. There was a big furore. Why have they stopped searching for him? The Guardia don't care about their public reputation, I'll tell you that now. So that just served them well to say they'd stopped searching for him. And while it's all, all the social media sort of hype going on about getting the other search team over and this, that, and the other, in the meantime, the Guardia are just searching for him quietly, and they found him. This is how it works in Spain. So I think that's exactly what happened in this case as well. They were quietly doing their investigations and letting maybe the fact that the search and everything was going on in different areas may have been worked well for the Guardia, because they like to keep things quiet. That's all I'm saying. But I suppose I do try and defend them, because this is the country that I live in, and I can just see the way they work. not saying it's right the way they work or wrong, or I don't, it's just the way it is. But anyway, the good news is, of course, that John's body is released and they are going to be able to lay him to rest properly. I think he's going home on the 20th of January. And then next Friday, the funeral, and we'll see if we can, watch that live, and there'll be details of how you can, I don't know if it'll be flowers, or sometimes they accept donations, don't they, for charities or whatever. So we've got all that information has got to come out. But the good news is John is going home, and I expect that before too long we will get developments in this case. And anyway, thanks for watching, thanks for caring about John. I'll see you really soon in the next video. Rest in peace, John, and love to the family. Bye.